Alright, friends, we're going to keep reading Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. Min Lee thinks she has found the borrowed line. Dragon thinks he has found the borrowed line. We are going to read 3 chapters today because they are all really short. While I'm reading, I want you guys to find some new vocabulary words. So remember, write them down as I read and then look them up when we're done and try to use those words this week. Alright? Alright, so we're on chapter 25. Ma and Ba found the days without Min Lee long and difficult. In the morning, as soon as they woke up, they rushed to Min Lee's bed to see if she was there. In the afternoon, they hurried home from the fields, hoping to find Min Lee waiting. And at night, with the rice bowl and set of chopsticks waiting for her at the table, they looked up at every sound of footsteps. But an empty bed and house always greeted them, and the footsteps always belonged to a passing neighbor. While Ma's anger had disappeared with the goldfish man, she grew a little thinner and paler every day, and Ba's eyes no longer twinkled. And one evening, in the middle of the night, Ba woke up alone in bed to a voice calling. "Wake up, old man," the fish said. "Wake up! Your wife needs you." Ba quickly rose and looked for Ma, who was sitting by Min Lee's bed. In the stillness of the darkness, Ma shook with sobs. "Oh, wife," Ba said softly, sitting next to her. Ma turned to him, her face shiny from wet tears. "What if Min Lee never returns?" Ma said. "What if we're always without her?" Ba put his hand over his face, brushing away the tears that were forming in his eyes. "I don't know," he said. "Neither do I," Ma said, and she buried her face in Min Lee's bed, crying in despair. Ba stroked her hair as she wept, occasionally closing his eyes as he fought his own gloom. Finally, as Ma's crying slowed and calmed, Ba said, "Do you remember the story I told you about the paper of happiness, and the secret which was one word written over and over again?" The back of Ma's head nodded, and Ba allowed himself a small smile. "I have thought a long time about what that word could have been," Ba said. "Was it wisdom, or honor, love, or truth? For a long time I had to think that the word was kindness." Ma's face remained hidden in Min Lee's bed, but her sobs had stopped, and Ba knew she was listening. "But now," Ba said, "I think, perhaps, the word was faith." A faint gray light seeped into the room, as if the moon was escaping from the clouds. Ma lifted her head and looked at Ba again. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and gave him a small, sad smile. "Perhaps," she said. "Perhaps you're right." And she placed her hand, wet with tears, in his. Right, we're on chapter 26. The next morning, Min Lee woke up alone under a heavy, rich blanket. Even though she was on the floor of the garden pagoda, she had slept comfortably, and as she sat up, she realized that was probably due to the silk pillows she had been lying on. The soft sunlight cast leaf shadows across her face, and the wind made gentle ripples in the moss-colored lake in front of her. The imperial garden was just as beautiful in the day as it was by night. On one side of her lay a small table with a small pot of tea, a bowl of rice porridge, and a tea-stained eggs. Breakfast, Min Lee thought to herself, but before she reached for it, she saw that a yellow brocade traveling bag lay on the other side of her. Inside the bag, Min Lee found her humble blanket, rabbit rice bowl, with needle and bamboo piece, chopsticks, a generous supply of cakes, and her hollow gourd full of fresh water. On the very top lay the gold-threaded pouch that had held the ripped page of fortune. Min Lee took the pouch and held it with 2 hands. "Well, I have the borrowed line," Min Lee thought. "At least I hope it is." So after a quick breakfast, Min Lee quietly left the pavilion. Part of her was so tempted to explore the mosaic walkways through the jewel-colored leaves, but she knew being discovered by one of the king's counselors would be disastrous. Also, she knew Dragon was patiently waiting outside the city, so using the king's secret door, Minli carefully left the garden and the walls of the inner city. And when she was out of the garden, Minli realized it was very early morning. The outer city was still sleeping. The stands were bare and the umbrellas were closed. Quickly, Minli scurried to the gate. With great effort, she was able to get through. She had to use a metal pole she'd found on the ground to lift the lock and lever one of the doors open. Even then, she was only able to get it open a crack and had to squeeze. As she fell through the gate, gasping for air, she was shocked to see Dragon lying in front of the stone lions, sleeping. It took a couple of prods before Dragon woke, and his loud morning yawns almost put Minli in a panic, but they were able to get back to the hiding shelter of the forest before anyone saw them. "What were you doing by the city?" Minli asked. "You were supposed to stay hidden." "I was getting the borrowed line," Dragon said. "What do you mean?" Minli said. "I have the borrowed line." And in a rush, the two of them told each other about their adventurous nights. Dragon stared at the ripped page from the book, and Minli looked at the red cord in Dragon's hand. "So which is the real borrowed line?" Dragon asked Minli. "I guess that is another question we'll have to ask the old man of the moon," Minli said. All right, chapter 27. I'm going to read this one today as well. With borrowed lines, Minli and Dragon continued their journey. Minli remade her compass with her rabbit rice bowl and followed the needle's pointed direction. As they traveled, the land became more barren, rocky, and steep. Without trees to tame it, the wind blew wildly, burning Minli's cheeks red with cold. The icy air shoved and pushed them as if trying to keep them back. Late in the afternoon, after traveling up stony ground, Dragon made a noise. "Look up ahead," he said. Far ahead of them seemed to be a spot of bright yellow. Against the gray landscape, it seemed like a fallen piece of gold. "Is it a forest? Trees with yellow leaves?" Minli asked. Then she looked at the gray stone surrounding them. But what trees could grow here? "I think there is a village," Dragon said, squinting his eyes. "If there is, we can get you some warmer clothes." Even though the cold hadn't bothered the dragon, he had noticed her shivering. "We won't reach it before night," Minli said, "but I think there's a cave up ahead. Let's stay there for the night, and tomorrow we'll try to reach the village, or whatever it is." The dragon agreed, and they made camp in the cave. The king's supply of traveling cakes saved her and Dragon from hunger, but Minli wished for the thick silk blanket. Even in the shelter of the cave, away from the wind, the earth was stark and cold. Minli built a fire as quickly as she could and sighed as its warmth slowly heated the air. But that night, Minli could not fall asleep. Even with the dragon snoring behind her, the fire crackling, and her blanket around her shoulders, her eyes did not close. Like the stone dust that the wind blew, thoughts kept circling in her head. She kept thinking about Ma and Ba and the orphan buffalo boy. With pangs of guilt, she thought about how Ma and Ba pushed her to go home early from the field, how her rice bowl was always the first filled, how every night when she went to sleep in her warm bed, she knew they were there, and how worried they must have been now that she was not. The buffalo boy didn't have that. Instead, he had a dirt floor, a pile of grass for his bed, a muddy buffalo, and a secretive friend. Yet he turned away her copper coin and laughed in the sun. Minli couldn't quite understand it, and, somehow, felt ashamed. But just as Minli shook her head with confusion, there was a sudden sound outside the cave. What was that? She cocked her head. There it was again, like a low grumble of thunder. Was it going to rain? Minli quietly got up and slipped out of the cave to see. But when she got outside, she screamed. The noise had not been the grumble of thunder. It had been the growl of a tiger. The giant tiger snarled and then jumped right at Minley. All right, that is the end of our chapters for today. I guess you'll have to come back and see what happens with Minley and the tiger. Go find your definitions for your vocabulary words.